And we are honored to introduce our keynote speaker for this meeting, who certainly needs no introduction. Our speaker is former Speaker of the House, the 50th Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who has been very interested in healthcare, in free markets, in personal freedom. He represented the 6th District of Georgia, which is near and dear to my heart. I have had one of my offices in that district for 25 years, and there's been a long history and long succession of very important leaders that have come out of the 6th District. Speaker Gingrich is known for his contract with America, which changed politics in this country with a GOP majority in the House for the first time in a generation. He has, I would like to say that he is a prolific author. He actually writes more than just nonfiction, which everybody will be able to receive his book today for being here, but he writes historical novels, which are actually some of my favorite books. He's written books about the Civil War, about the Revolutionary War, and about World War II. A couple of my favorite books are Pearl Harbor and Days of Infamy, which are just splendid books. I highly commend them. I could go on, and I don't want to eat up the time that we have with the speaker. So without any further ado, please let me introduce our guest speaker, Newt Gingrich.
Well, let me first of all thank all of you for taking time out of your busy lives to come here and try to affect public policy and try to help America work its way towards a better health system. Let me say, as part of my background, when I was a history teacher, my dad was a career soldier in the infantry, and I spent a long period trying to figure out how the system works. I ran for Congress in '74 in the middle of Watergate, and I lost. I came back and ran in '76 with Jimmy Carter at the head of the Democratic ticket in Georgia, and I lost. And I finally won in '78. But I began, as early as '74, I began dealing with health as an issue because you couldn't run for office. And between doctors, hospitals, pharmacists, and patients and insurance agents, and you name it, if you're going to be in politics, sooner or later, you're going to talk about health care. And it turned out we were just chatting about this. I actually opposed Certificate of Need in '74, so I have a long tradition of, and mine was frankly just theoretical, that I think the idea of having bureaucracies set up decision-making almost guarantees politics and almost guarantees that the entrenched interests will always protect themselves. Along that line, I wrote a book a couple years ago called Breakout, and the subtitle was Pioneers of the Future and Prison Guards of the Past. And I made the case basically that if the stagecoach industry had had the right lobbyists, you wouldn't have railroads yet because they would have blocked railroads as unfair competition. So a lot of this, what we are going through, is normal. We've had, I think, two major challenges in how we've dealt with health now for the last 30 or 40 years. The one is that the way Washington defines the problem is exactly wrong. The problem is not insurance. I mean, first of all, as a thought process, and we may do some polls in this in the near future, I'd be very curious if you said to the average American, if we guaranteed 100% access to care, do you care about insurance? Remember, for example, you have 8,000 federal community health clinics, which are never counted in. You have some places, I know one I visited in South Carolina, we have doctors who give free medicine. And you have all sorts of ways of solving problems. And I really got turned on to this because I was in a debate. Rick Perry and I were on one side, and two liberal Democrats on the other side. And Perry said, and they were after Perry for not expanding Medicaid. And he said, well, we had taken a totally different decision. We decided that insuring you wasn't as important as caring for you. And so as long as we could guarantee access to care, we didn't care whether or not you had insurance. And they didn't know what to say. because they knew they couldn't be against it. They couldn't be anti-care. So they were, I mean, they literally were just kind of like, wow. One of them said to me later, that was really like watching a hard, fast pitch knocked out of the park. She said I had no idea what to do at that point. So part of it is the misdefinition of what the problem is. The second problem, which I want to suggest you've got to think about in a self-critical way about yourselves also. All of healthcare is about greed. Nobody wants to talk about that. I mean, why do the pharmaceutical companies love the way things are going? Because they make lots of money. You know, why do hospitals protect themselves? Because they make money. Why are the insurance companies like they are? Because they make money. The biggest losers have been doctors who have not been able to stop the centralization of power. And so between government bureaucracy, insurance bureaucracy, and hospital bureaucracy, doctors have probably had the hardest time of any group. But it all goes back to the same pattern. So when you go in with an interesting idea, we had this happen last year, because I'm fascinated with the extraordinary rapid advance of science and technology, and have been my whole life. And there's a company, whose name I'll forget, so I'm not going to try to say it, but there's a company which invented a self-administered eye exam. And their pitch was, because the American Optometry Association says you should get an eye exam every other year, but if you have contacts, you have to go in every year in order to get the contact renewed, which in essence uses the contacts as an excuse to create an unnecessary additional visit. So these guys had invented a machine that you could basically do on your own computer at home, and you didn't have to go in. And so you save money, you save time. And of course, in Georgia and virtually every state, the local association promptly went to the legislature to outlaw it, because it was going to cut into their revenue. It had nothing to do with safety, it had nothing to do with health care. It had to do with money. And so part of what we need is an honest conversation in America about money. Because if you follow the money, you begin to understand a lot of what's wrong with the system. I once was advising an insurance company, which tried to go into Pittsburgh. And they went to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and they said, you only have 3 major insurance companies. You really need another insurance company. And the guy said, no, we don't. We have a perfect relation with the 3 insurance companies. And we have no interest in a 4th company coming in, and we will not negotiate with you because you don't fit our model. Yeah, the same thing happened with one of the most famous and on the left, one of the most loved institutions, which is the hospital system in California, and my mind has gone blank for a half second. Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is a fabulous system, which refuses to take Medi-Cal. Why do they have the margins they have? Well, because they don't take care of any poor people, and they don't want to take care of poor people, and they are enormously powerful in lobbying, so they ain't going to take care of poor people. Now, as an example of all this, we once had, as a member of our Center for Health Transformation, the largest not-for-profit chain in Northern California. And I was visiting Kaiser because I was intrigued. So there's some things Kaiser does really, really well. Their use of electronic medical records. I mean, they produced various problems with medicines earlier than anybody else because they have such quantitative databases. And they can see when certain things aren't working. So I was studying Kaiser, and I was talking to these guys, Sutter Health, and they were both getting IT systems. And they were both getting the IT system from Epic. And they were consciously designed not to communicate with each other. That was part of the contract. And I said, what are you doing? They said, we don't want the doctors to have an ability to transfer. If we had a common IT system, then they could, it would be as though your Visa card only worked at your bank, and any other bank you went to around the world, it wouldn't work because they wanted to keep you captive. And it's that kind of stuff. So you have to, the reason I'm telling you this is, we don't today have the right language to explain what's going on. And so we get caught in morally sounding, the reason you need a certificate of need is because otherwise you're going to have all of these cheap operations come in that aren't going to be really doing the whole thing, and they're going to take advantage, and they're only going to do the high value things. They're not going to take on the low value things. And so here we'll be left as this poor hospital, and we have 6,000 employees, and we're going to crush you if you vote against us. That's what passes for dialogue in American healthcare today. Does this make sense to all of you? Now, let me impose on you for a couple minutes, because I don't often get a chance to have this many really smart medical people in one room. And I want to talk about two different things, and then I'm going to toss it open for questions. I will suggest to all of you, by the way, that Understanding Trump is a really cool book. And that you, if you get excited later on, you might want to send a note out to all of your friends on email or Facebook or whatever. But having passed the commercial phase of this project, I want to talk first about the rate of change, and I want to talk about a little bit about the politics in Washington and in the state governments. I'm a permanent optimist. I tell people that in my heart, I'm a 4-year-old who wakes up every morning knowing that there's a cookie, and my job is to spend the day finding the cookie. And so I'm happy all day long because I know that right around the corner there's going to be a cookie. And it really does capture me. I went through 16 years of trying to create a majority. We lost it. I got in November of '78. By December of '78, I was in charge of long-range planning for the Congressional Campaign Committee because we had not been a majority for 24 years. We lost in 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, and 92. So when I tell you that I'm really a determined optimist, I mean, you know, I got through every day knowing tomorrow we'll find the cookie. I mean, so part of my optimism is just the sheer momentum of science and technology. A couple quick stories. Part of this I don't understand. Some of you may understand this, and I'm actually going out to NIH, I think this next week, to get briefed by a couple of people because I don't understand it. Apparently, the best cells, I'm very fascinated with regenerative medicine, which I'm going to suggest to you is going to have an extraordinary impact in the very, very near future. And we are working with Sanford Health in South Dakota and North Dakota, who have actually bought a regenerative system in Munich because it's outside the FDA. And they're doing very cool things, which I'll talk about in a second. And we talk with Sanford a lot about the future organization of health delivery systems. So apparently, the best cells for regenerative medicine are your belly fat cells. I do not know why. I'm obviously available now for a huge number. But apparently, they take the fat out, and then they grow the cells, and they get huge cultures of cells. And the part I don't understand, which is why I'm going out to NIH, is apparently the cells recognize the way they're being organized and change function accordingly. So what Sanford is specializing in Munich is on knees and shoulders. And so a friend of mine's wife, for example, needed either a knee operation or new cartilage. And so she flew to Munich, and they injected her with stem cells, who apparently recognized that they were now supposed to become cartilage because they were in a cartilage-like place. So it takes about a year for it. The pain goes away very fast, but you don't get the strength in the knee until the cells have regenerated deep enough. But over a period of time, she will have a completely new knee based upon her own cells generating her own cartilage. Okay, so another friend of mine is a researcher at Wake Forest whose specialty is trying to figure out how to grow a kidney with your own cells rather than have you go through kidney dialysis. Okay, and what he does is he grows huge quantity of your cells, and he then uses 3D printing on a lattice that resembles a kidney, and that lattice is shaped to your body. So they know the size of the kidney in your body. They recreate it with 3D printing, and apparently, as I said, I don't fully understand this. Apparently, when the cells figure out that they're a kidney shape, they start saying, well, we must be kidney. And they start functioning like it. This is, trust me, this is beyond science fiction. Yeah, Tony Atala. And so I'm very interested in how all of these things evolve, because when you start talking about cost, if you could find a plausible cost level for you growing your own kidney rather than kidney dialysis, the change in quality of life, the change in long-term cost, and then you got to change the rules, because the first-year cost of a brand new kidney is greater than the first-year cost of dialysis, but less than the lifetime cost of dialysis. So now we actually are working with several insurance companies to think through how could you change everything. It's much like the invention of home mortgages. When people used to have to buy a house for cash, and somebody came along and said, well, what if I gave you 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? We changed the whole housing market. So you have to do the same kind of thing. So take that as an example. The other zone I'm very busy working on is brain science, because it is the most important area for long-term cost control in health. And what I want is not cost control, I want cost collapse. The best example of cost collapse is the number of iron lungs currently in use, because the polio vaccine eliminated them. And so you save a huge amount of human pain and a huge amount of money every year because we no longer get polio. Well, we are working at the early stages of whether it's Alzheimer's or it is Parkinson's or it's mental health, schizophrenia, for example. And we're really at the very early stages of breakthroughs that could be remarkable. That requires you to change FDA, because the FDA models are all pharmaceutical models. So you can't take a potential breakthrough and say, well, that's going to take 26 years to test. Although, in fact, you may not know for sure for 26 years. And so you've got to really rethink the whole model of what are you looking at and how are you doing it. But we're going to have breakthroughs on a giant scale. The reason I cite those to you is one of the challenges, I think, particularly if you are in relatively independent or small group practice, that you have to think about and you have to help us think about, is how do we design the flow of information to enable people at a relative investment to stay current? Because we're going to have, the difference right now between the best people in certain specialties and the 10th best person is night and day, because the best person is now doing something which will become standard in 8 or 10 years. But it's so far different than what people learn in medical school. And then this is going to accelerate, I think. This is going to become a huge part of this pattern. And I think part of the centrality of being a doctor is going to be relating to how do I continue to evolve. And it'll be different than the traditional continuing education stuff. It may mean that we really develop systems where you only pull it forward when you need it. So instead of trying to figure out how do I scan everything to remain sort of relevant, you say when a patient comes in who has a particular need, I've got to be able to go through an entire learning package in a relatively short amount of time to know what literally is this week's current information, which may have changed dramatically from 3 months ago. And you're going to see that scale. I'll close this with one example, I'm going to talk about politics. I went out a couple years back and talked to the National Neuroscience Conference, which at that time was 37,000 people. It started a decade earlier with 800. And there are just that many people in that many different places doing work. It is astonishing the wave that is coming at us. And we don't have very good systems for integrating that information and getting people to best of class, or more importantly, getting best of class to every doctor, which is what we want. So that's something for you all to think about, is what's the right kind of systems to enable people to pull forward knowledge so they're getting the most recent, most effective. They're doing it in a way which they can afford to do in terms of time. Because what you can't do is have people have to go back and retake medical school every 6 years. Although the amount of change may literally be comparable to having a new medical school curriculum. That is, if medical schools change, which they don't. That's another great example. Is that medical schools, like all internally defined institutions, like to do what they've always done, which is what they did back when their grandfather was there. They don't actually understand why you want them to change, which is a major problem in how we generate doctors in this country. Now, the politics of all this. I think there are 3 components you got to be aware of as you go down the road. The first is the one I mentioned about the whole system. That is, if the fight you're actually in is an interest group fight, then you got to figure out how to bring to bear enough resources to defeat the interest group. Because it's not a fight. When you end up in a fight, for example, with a pharmaceutical company, they understand what the outcome they want. They want to maximize their income, and they can generate 23 good arguments for it. But the underlying story is they want to maximize their income, and so you got to figure out in that kind of a fight, can you arouse enough enough allies to beat them, because you're not going to get them to voluntarily change. And you see, by the way, the beginning of the break in the ice there, which is these idiots who buy companies as entrepreneurs and raise the price 800% on a 40-year-old drug. I mean, that stuff is going to keep the pharmaceuticals on permanent defense, and they don't have an answer for it. So every time you start down one of these, like when you get into a CON fight, what you really want to figure out is, what's the balance of power? And then how do I aggregate enough power to beat these guys? Because in the end, it's going to come down to power. And their capacity in the state legislature to lobby, or their capacity in the Congress to lobby. And that's a very key part of this. And unfortunately, this is a city, and I think every state capital is the same way, where I tell people, the old order has lobbyists and the new order has press releases. And that's a major challenge to how you win that kind of fight. The second thing to understand is every elected official, with very few exceptions, is overwhelmed. I mean, think about waking up in the morning and hearing that congressmen have been shot at baseball practice. Well, guess what that day's going to be about? Or you wake up and you discover this morning Trump went down and tightened up on Cuba. Or you find out that Mueller's done X, or you find out that the Russians have done Y. The range of things, whether you're a state legislator or you're a congressman, the range of things you have to know a little bit about is unbelievable. And so you don't have time to genuinely get educated. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of why this is important, and if you take these to heart, you will become dramatically more effective in affecting change. The first is, anytime you go to see somebody who has power, ask yourself the question, what if they say yes when you walk in the room? Okay, you walk in, you're about to give them your pitch, they say yes. What did they say yes to? What people tend to do is they tend to go in and explain their problem. So you want to go in and say, this is why CONs aren't really very good, and this is this, and this is that. And they'll give you 15 minutes, and they're fairly smart, and they'll ask 2 or 3 reasonable questions, and you'll think, wow, we had a great conversation. You'll get up to leave. You'll feel like now they're going to think about your problem. And you won't notice that there's another group walking in as you're walking out. And a serious senior member can easily have 20 meetings in a day. Now, what are the odds he remembers meeting 3? And says, boy, that's the one I want to think about after dinner tonight. Furthermore, even if he thought about it, if you haven't come to a conclusion, why do you think he's going to come, or she is going to come to a conclusion? So you're far better off to think through, if they understood what I understood, what is it they would do? Because you want to think of them as action figures, not these aren't college professors, these aren't intellectuals, these aren't teachers. They're people who vote yes or no. And you want to figure out, what is it you want them to say yes to? Or what is it you want them to say no to? The fourth thing that you have to think about is language. One of the reasons Trump won is he speaks at a 4th grade level. Now, he doesn't speak at a 4th grade level because he's stupid. He speaks at a 4th grade level because he was not in real estate on the finance side. He was in real estate on the construction side. And if you're going to go down to the construction site and talk to people, you want to talk to them in a language they understand. And you want to have them open up and talk to you because they think that you and they are similar. Okay? Your job, the challenge you face is, and this is true of almost every professional group, you know so much that you would like to share with them what you know. They don't want to know what you know. Furthermore, they know that if they knew it, they couldn't use it because they don't have all the rest of the knowledge you have that surrounds it. So part of your job, and we were talking about this in terms of, for example, cost. I mean, if we could actually put together, for example, the the example of the hospital emergency room 20,000 versus the doctor delivered 300. That begins to be, which would you rather pay? You have a problem with Medicaid. This package is impossible. This package lets you take 40% out of Medicaid. Which future do you want? And here are the three things you have to do. But you have to be in a position where you can explain in simple, understandable language what the outcome is that you are offering and what the action is which will get you the outcome. That's the heart of how to do this effectively. And the reason you want to do it in part is because that's what you want to say on radio and television. That's what you want to say on Facebook. That's what you say on Twitter. And that's what you want to say when you write an op-ed. So you have a common language that grows that enables people to say, okay, which do I like? Do I like the $300 price or the $20,000 price? And then you let the hospital executive come in and explain, or the $20,000 price is a morally superior price because it is an investment in the virtues of a huge, giant bureaucracy. And your answer is fine. I mean, if you love paying $20,000 for a $300 product, go, that's fine. Just don't kid yourself. You've chosen to pay 68 times more than it's worth. This is called being a stupid shopper. And if the politicians of our state want to be stupid shoppers, maybe we should elect some politicians who are smart shoppers. Now, you just changed the whole debate. So I'll say a couple of last things, and then we're going to toss it open for questions. I believe that where we are right now is the greatest moment of openness in my lifetime, in that the system is currently shattered, doesn't know how to put itself back together, and in my judgment is going to get much worse before it gets better, because the problems are going to keep compounding, and we're going to, I mean, for example, the health bill the House passed shouldn't have been passed. The Senate bill the Senate's writing in secret is by definition dangerous, because anytime you write a bill that affects 1/5 of the economy in secret, nobody's smart enough to know what's in the bill. And so when you finally unveil it, in the age of the internet, thousands of really smart people are going to read the bill. And they're going to start saying, well, do you realize in paragraph 209 you do X? And they're going to go, oh no, I didn't actually know that. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you have to really be careful and thoughtful about. And I want to urge all of you, it's in the book, but it's something I want you to send to your friends. There is an essay by Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. It's very short, it's about 800 words, you can Google it. It's called IYI, Intellectual Yet Idiot. And it is brilliant, and it is precisely what we are up against at every level of our current system. And his central argument is that we have become a culture in which at least 40% of the people are really good at taking tests and writing essays. So they get into really elite schools where they study under a professor who is really good at taking tests and writing essays. And then they graduate with really good grades because they really took good tests and wrote good essays. And then they get a job at the New York Times or the Supreme Court or the NIH. And their only great weakness is they don't know anything. Because, in fact, so they could write a brilliant essay on how to change your tire. But if you had a flat tire, they'd have to call AAA. Because they don't know how to do it for real. I first encountered, I realized when I read Taleb, it took me all the way back to a brilliant book by Halberstam called The Best and the Brightest, which was a study of the cabinet in the Kennedy administration that got into Vietnam, because all of them had this terrific theoretical knowledge whose only weakness was it had no relationship to the real world. And so this is a lot, so you have the CMS bureaucracy, none of whom see patients. I mean, you have the state Medicaid program, none of whom see patients. I mean, if you could just compile every bureaucrat being paid in the health system who doesn't see a patient, you'd have a first stage of explaining why it's a disaster. And they're the ones who make the rule. I mean, I once, many years ago, in 1981, I went down to see David Stockman, who had been a congressman with me, and he and I had actually written the original budget of Hope and Opportunity in 1980. He'd become Reagan's budget director. So in August, I called, and they were out on vacation, and so they were slowed down. I said, I want to come down and just chat with you. And I said, what's the biggest single thing you've learned? And Stockman was very smart. He said, this is a city where if you know enough to have substantive knowledge of the topic, you are by definition not important enough to be in the meeting. And if you're important enough to be in the meeting, you by definition do not know the topic. So all major decisions are intuitive because nobody in the meeting knows what they're doing. And that's basically true. I mean, and that's what's happening in the Senate right now. Because with the exception of one or two people, none of them are doctors or nurses or pharmacists or anything practical. They're theoreticians or lawyers. I'm not sure which is worse. And so that's part of what you have to deal with, I think. But Taleb, you'll find that Taleb's essay is really helpful because it'll begin to explain. I'm going to close with this thought, and then we're going to just toss it open. In the summer of 1960, we had moved from, my dad was in the Army, we'd moved from Stuttgart, 7th Army headquarters, to Fort Benning. And we had a Doberman pinscher called Kathleen's Pride of Riley. And my mother's name was Kathleen, and we got the dog at Fort Riley. And Pride was a wonderful dog and a very happy, pleasant dog. And we spent the summer on an experiment. I tried to teach her how to read. And by late August, we got to a point where she could read comics okay. But I could tell she really wasn't into it. I mean, it wasn't her thing. And so we sat down in late August, and I said, okay, well, how about this deal? You get to chase rabbits, and I'll read. And she seemed to really like that deal, and she took off. Ever since, when I've encountered certain kinds of people, I remind myself that it's very hard to teach Pride how to read. And part of what you have to do is understand, a lot of the people you're going to try to reason with haven't got a clue. And they have no interest in getting a clue. And if they wanted to get a clue, they couldn't get a clue. They're just not very smart. And they haven't done very much. And those are the people who run most of the health system. And those are the people who run the bureaucracies. So that I hope that gives you some context, at least, of understanding why you're frustrated. I'm not trying to make you feel better. Just trying to give you a self-explanatory awareness. And what Taleb says, which is interesting, and fits doctors, for example, he said the difference is whether or not you have skin in the game. If you're a person who makes abstract rules about people you've never met in situations you've never been in, you have no skin in the game. You have no learning curve. If you're a person who is personally responsible for achieving something, you have a very high learning curve. And I think it's very important for us to understand we want to build a decentralized society in which people actually are responsible and people actually experience life and people actually learn every day because it's the cost of being competent. And that's what Trump is. Trump is giving us an opportunity. He's not by himself enough, but he's enough to start. And if the rest of us decide to help him, we may really, in the next 8 years, turn the country in remarkable degree into a dramatically more dynamic society. So, sweeping overview. Can we take questions?
Yes. That was great. Well, so the moral of the story is we should let all these people chase rabbits.
If you could get them out off their butt and get them to go do it, that'd be great. That'd be a big improvement for America if half the bureaucrats were chasing rabbits.
I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. So, with respect to what we're here to talk about today, certificate of need, the real culprit in perpetrating this on the country was the federal government when they passed a law in 1974 to encourage states to take this on. Is it reasonable to think about in this political climate with this Secretary of HHS possibly doing something to unwind it, like maybe tying Medicaid block grants to reward states that repeal CON laws?
Probably not.
So that's not that you don't.
Just because it's too hard. It's too indirect a shot. Which is not to say there aren't things you ought to do to repeal the laws. For example, you could structure it that states which deliver Medicaid less expensively actually get rewarded for being less expensive.
Right.
And states that are more expensive actually pay a penalty for being more expensive. You could take, you said I think there are 14 states that have repealed CON.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things you have to have is a chart that says, here's the average CON state's cost, here's the average non-CON state's cost. Why are we paying the differential? And you can, and there's a point to start down the road. You could also say that the federal government ought to reward states for unwinding the system, not force them to, but reward them. That if you'll unwind the system, you get to keep half of the savings for the first 5 years.
Right. Right.
And that kind of thing.
That's a good approach.
Yeah. But the other thing I would do is I would look at the 25 states that have a Republican governor, Republican Senate, Republican House, figure out which of those are not yet CON states, are not yet repealed CON, and I go at all of them on Medicaid and on employee on their own employee health insurance and say, if you were to repeal it, here's what your costs are going to be for the next 10 years. If you don't repeal it, here's what your costs. Why do you want to charge the taxpayers of your state this unnecessary amount of extra money and make it a really big fight over the scale of money, and start finding candidates who say, you know, I think I'm willing to take the risk and save the $3 billion or whatever the number comes. Numbers on a 10-year basis, the numbers will be big.
That's a good strategy.
You start off with a real interesting proposition. You start off and say, hey, what if we got rid of all institutions, right? And we focus on the services. And there's one area, you know, in this whole debate over healthcare, we're still talking about cost shifting. We're not talking about reducing the overall cost. But to your point, when we started out, there is a delivery model around primary care. It's about 80% of the healthcare transactions that we see called direct primary care. It doesn't involve a third-party insurance. This is something we've been trying to get traction on. There was a loophole in Obamacare that allowed for it, but it's something that we still can't pay for out of CMS. Has there been any chatter on the Hill to go off and push that?
I don't know.
Okay.
And I would say but that's a simple, doable project. I mean, to say, here's how much we could save, here's the proof that this is how much we could save, here are people willing to be witnesses that this is how much we could save, and it requires the following 2 amendments. I mean, now you have that's a package that's a definable, doable package.
So, as you were wrapping up your talk, I didn't see the optimism. So,
In what sense?
Because you were saying, you're talking about people who run the healthcare system, have no experience in taking care of patients,
Right,
and they have no skin in the game,
right.
and yet you're an optimist. So when you're looking at such what seems to be an insurmountable problem, how
I
do you
didn't
go
say-
about fixing it?
I didn't say it was insurmountable.
Oh,
I said it was a current fact.
so how do we optimistically?
Introduce a bill that says you can't be involved in regulating healthcare unless you actually have dealt with a patient
There you go.
within the last year. Have doctor, nurse, pharmacy practitioners who are half-time at CMS. Replace all the CMS bureaucrats who've never seen a patient. I mean, one simple thing would be to get some graduate student to go and interview CMS people and find out how many of them have ever actually seen a patient, not counting their own family. You know, and you'd find out that 80%, 85%, they haven't got a clue what happens in the real world. They live in a paper world where they do paper things. But by the way, you also understand, I am strategically an optimist. Okay? One day when we were in the middle of the Trump transition, Charles Krauthammer came up to me in the green room, and he said, why are you not more bothered? And I said, well, compared to the Civil War, this isn't much. And he looked at me and said, your standard is the Civil War? And the truth is, my standard is Washington spending 8 years winning our freedom and Lincoln spending 4 years in our bloodiest war. I mean, you want to change a system this big? It is going to be a running fight. Because I keep telling people, you want to drain the swamp? Guess what? The alligators are all going to bite you. And you don't want to get bit? Don't drain the swamp. But don't come and tell me, oh, I'm really heroic. I want to drain the swamp, but why are the alligators mad? What do you think they're going to be?
By definition, this is a room of optimists because we're all here
Yeah,
talking about
right.
this problem.
most of us are concerned that nothing leads to socialized medicine, not innovation, et cetera. Can you give me a path where neither of those bills are good and yet we still have an optimistic healthcare future?
No, my working assumption is we will, at best, if we get lucky, pass a mediocre bill, which will lead almost immediately to hearings on the next bill. That this is a multi-year, it never ends. I mean, people say, oh, this is the big, I fought Hillary Care. It never ends. First of all, 20% of the economy ain't going away. Healthcare is going to continue to be innovating, continue to be changing. I think you have, and you told me earlier you're doing part of this. You have two huge opportunities in what do you call it?
Direct primary care?
Direct primary care. I'll try to memorize it, but I'm not very good at it. But so you take direct primary care. Self-insured companies are a huge market, all right? States that have real budget problems, that have balanced budget requirements, are a real market. Okay, those are the first two starting points. Describing actual success, I mean, it's very important to be able to say, look, I can bring you 23 different doctors groups that are practicing this today, and I can show you what their average savings are. And so here is a better solution. And part of it is to be very, very noisy. I mean, you know, I'm a practitioner. One of the reasons I've survived this long. Remember, I left office in 1998, and in December of '98. I'm still here, and the reason is I'm very noisy. You know, this is the heart of what Trump learned. So part of what you have to do is figure out, and you have to figure it out by having vivid examples and obvious questions, like, you know, how big would the gap have to be for us to quit being stupid? You also ought to be very aggressively on Facebook and on, you know, and you ought to be saying to people, if you're paying more than the $300, if you paid $20,000 for this, you ought to really be talking about suing these people because they should have charged you $300. And so you want to be on the internet, you want to be on Facebook. We have I think 995,000 followers on Facebook, and we got there just because of constant repetition. So if you had different doctors every day talking about this stuff, you know, better healthcare at lower cost now would be how I would describe it.
995,000 of your followers would love the phrase direct primary care.
I notice I didn't use that. You want better health outcomes at lower cost now. The way you get it is direct primary care. The doctor-directed primary care. Direct primary care. DMP. DPC, direct primary care. See, it's almost impossible for me to learn it. You may need a new term. Yes?
I just wanted to know if you had an opportunity to see the super secret Senate.
No. I have not. I have no idea what's in it. I'm sure that it is being elegantly written for the purpose of getting 50 votes. And whether it has any relationship to realities on what happens to you up here is the reality of getting something out of the Senate becomes reality. Whether or not it's any good is a second order question. And that's just the nature of the American system. It's always been like this.
Any thoughts, Mr. Speaker, on how to graduate from residency program at GW? And during the course of 8 years there, there was no discussion of conservative principles. And we try to have the articulation that the majority of the students have no concept of history, just trying to go from one step to the test to the next. So, but that's the next generation of doctors. I think it's being allocated around across the
Sure.
nation. Any ideas on how you can break into that, like kind of sort of the plants and periodic moons, the idea there's another reality? Because I feel they just don't buy into the market system of medicine, and that's what we're trying to shift. People are out practicing, but they're not getting informed early enough.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming medical schools are like the rest of academics. You know, I mean, I always tell people the Reagan defeated communism in Moscow, but not in the academic world. And that's just a fact. And so at some point, we'll go back and we'll clean it up. But it's very hard right now to do. The nice thing is the second they leave, they start changing because it's so stupid. But if it is a problem, and you have it everywhere in the country, and it's unfortunate, and most of you are doing well enough, you probably give money to the school you're an alumni of, so they can hire socialists to teach your grandchildren to despise you. I mean, if you think about it, it's truly stupid. I mean, the most successful people in America subsidize the destruction of the value system that made them successful, and have no notion of it, don't even have any thought of it. I'll tell you what, a very good friend of mine is Alan Guelzo, is a professor at Gettysburg College. A brief commercial. I'm actually trying to raise some money for him because he has a matching grant. So if any of you know foundations or whatever, we still need to raise about a couple $100,000. But Guelzo is a great conservative intellectual. His descriptions of what we're up against but are very much like yours. But one of the things he's done is some of you may have used this. There's a company that educates by audio tapes, and you can take courses from them. And he has done a whole series of history courses that people buy. And he came by one day when he'd finished taping one of these courses. And I said, how do you think about this? He said, my average student for these courses is a retired dentist who spent all their life working very hard at dentistry and now has the time to say, gee, I wonder what America's all about. And he said, the number of people I get who are retired, but who are now listening to all these courses, fascinated by them, come to Gettysburg to see the battlefield, et cetera, is amazing. And so part of my optimism is that over time, we have a better product than the left does. And over time, we just have to, and I'll tell you, I just wrote my newsletter today, and any of you who want it, you can go to gingrichproductions.com. We do 2 newsletters a week that are free. The one today is on Jeff Sessions as a profile in courage. If you look at his testimony last week and the way he stood up to the left, it is what every Republican should study. I'm going to actually do an edited version of the 5 or 6 big lessons and try to give it to every single Republican incumbent and every Republican candidate, because he went toe-to-toe, didn't back off an inch. He was appropriately angry when he should have been. It was really a brilliant study. Well, that's that kind of thing. What happens is you're a young person, you're out here for the first time, you look up, and you suddenly go, yeah, that guy's right and that's wrong. And we can win the argument if we're willing to make the argument. But we have to have the guts to make the argument. And then some of you may want to help with this. I just talked to the college Republicans. I'm encouraging them to set up a legal defense fund so that any student who's prepared to take on a professor gets a lawyer. So if a professor is saying things that are untrue, the student can actually move to fire the professor for lying to the students and have a lawyer who steps in and files the brief for free. And if we can get that rolling, particularly in the age when you can videotape with your cell phone, professors will go crazy. I mean, it'll be a major step back towards an accountable, responsible education system.
Hi, Speaker Gingrich. I'm actually a college student right now at Duke University.
Okay.
I can attest to the fact that there's a lot of liberal minds out there, and I actually appreciate what you just said. I'm actually the vice president of my college Republican chapter at Duke. And my question is, it's kind of broad. People my age are becoming so discouraged from, the system itself, based on the way things are going. What is the responsibility of my generation to come up and raise the swamp and
Well,
create effective change?
if you get a chance sometime, I wrote a novel called To Try Men's Souls, which is actually the beginning of Thomas Paine's second great pamphlet. His first one really explained the Declaration of Independence better than anybody else and became a bestseller. And Washington knew that Washington's army went from 30,000 at Brooklyn in September to 2,500 outside Philadelphia in December. And of the 2,500, 1/3 did not have boots and walked in, their feet wrapped in burlap bags, leaving a trail of blood. And he had commissioned Paine to write a pamphlet called The Crisis, which Washington decided on a crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night in a snowstorm. And there's a great scene where all of Washington's generals were opposed. And Washington said, look, if we don't have a victory, this army is going to melt away. When the army melts away, we will have lost. When we lose, every person in this room will be hung. So we have no risks. So he literally has the officers reading from the crisis as the men get in the boats early in the evening to cross the Delaware in a snowstorm. And that's where it says, these are the times that try men's souls. Now, I tell you that. They crossed the Delaware. They marched during the night. It turns out there are 2 ravines, not one. They're 4 hours late. It's already past dawn. But 2 weird things happened. One was a Virginia unit, totally on its own, wandering around, fired shots at Trenton, woke up the Germans, who then got cold and pissed off, and then were told, go back to bed, because clearly just a bunch of guys out, farmers out riding around shooting. And second, the snowstorm was coming from the north so heavily that if you were a European, you knew no army could march in it. And it didn't occur to them that if you're Americans and you have to, find deer for your family to eat, etc., it's just a snowstorm. So his army actually catches them by surprise, even though they don't hit them till about 8 o'clock in the morning. They capture 800 Germans for the loss of 1 American. They run like crazy and get across the Delaware before the British Army can catch them. Within 2 weeks, he has 15,000 volunteers. So my point to you is to say to your friends and to say to yourself, the price of freedom is somebody has to have the guts to fight. And you fight every day. I mean, I've been doing this since August of '58, and I'm beginning to learn it. But you just learn to do it. And Washington did it. Washington's in the field for 8 years, spends 2 weeks at Mount Vernon in 8 years. You just do it. The alternative is not to be free.